In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about some loan facts, some principal and interest. Let's go ahead and get started. This is a review from the last video. The amount of interest that's paid during the K period we denote by cap I sub K, and we get that by looking at the balance at the time period before, at time K minus 1, and multiply that by whatever the periodic effective interest rate is. So that goes back to the Module 1 stuff. That's how we calculate the amount of interest. And then we can calculate the amount of principal in a payment by subtracting the amount of interest that we're paying in that payment from whatever the amount of the payment is. And of course, if you add up the amount of principal that's being repaid in the first payment with the amount of principal that's being repaid in the second payment, and you continue that pattern with all of the payments, then you add up all the principal amounts that are being paid in each of the individual payments, and you get the total amount that was borrowed. You get the loan amount L. Now, I want to look at, so this is, what's on the screen now is how to calculate some values at a single, for a single payment or for a single period. And so what I want to talk about now is a couple of other type problems that you'll see. One will be how we calculate the amount of principal that's repaid through a time period from time K to some other time value M. And another is the amount of interest that's going to be paid for a time period, not for a single payment, but for a time period. And I put them in this order because generally this is going to be the order in which you would calculate these amounts. If you look at the first two lines there, or the first two amounts that are on this slide, the amount of interest that's paid in a single payment, that's cap I sub K, you generally that's going to be the first thing you calculate if you want to calculate the amount of principal that's repaid with a single payment. Because again, you go through this calculation where you subtract off from the total amount of the payment. This is that line, cap P sub K equals cap C sub K minus cap I sub K on your screen there. You have to calculate generally, based on the information that you usually know. You usually know what the payment amount is, and then you calculate what the amount of interest in a single payment is, and then subtract those to get the amount of principal that's repaid in a single payment. However, if instead of a single payment, now we're talking about a payment or an amount over a period of time. So I'm looking at the second two amounts on the on your screen there. Then we generally would calculate the amount of principal repaid over a time period, even if we were ultimately seeking the amount of interest that's paid over that time period. We would first calculate the amount of principal that's being repaid during that time period. You'll see what I mean in just a second. So let's look at an example. Let's capture some information on a timeline. Let's say the time period I'm talking about is from time 10 to time 13. So the difference between the balances at time 10 and time 13 are accounted for by the payments at times 11, 12, and 13. Those are the payments between time 10 and time 13. Remember, the payment at time 10 is not is already reflected in the symbol cap B sub 10 because it represents the balance just after that payment. Okay, so let me make up some numbers here. Let's say that I have a balance at time 10 of $1,000, and I'm just going to make up some numbers. Let's say that the payments at times 11, 12, and 13 are 120, 130, and 140. Again, don't try to make sense of the numbers I'm giving to you right now. I'm just going to make up some numbers, some nice numbers to work with. So let's say that the interest at time 11, the amount of interest that was repaid is 100. Well, if 100 was the amount of interest paid is 100, the total payment was 120 at time 11. That means I'm paying off in principal the difference, 20. 20 is being repaid in principal. And let me make up some other numbers at times 12 and time 13. Let's say that at time 12, I'm making it up, let's just say 95 was paid in interest. That means the difference between 95 and 130, or which is 35, would be repaid in principal. And then at time 13, let's say 90 was paid in interest. The interest payment was 90. Then 140 minus 90, or 50, would be the amount of principal that would be repaid with that payment. Okay, so now I've got this information. I can look at what's in blue here, and I can calculate what the balances are at the intermediate times. For instance, at time 11, the balance at time 11 would be the balance at time 10, which is 1,000 minus the 20 that was paid back. So I get 980 is how much I would still owe at time 11, just after the 11th payment. And then from that 980, I would subtract 35, which was the amount of principal repaid at time 12, to get 945 would be the balance just after that payment. And then finally at time 13, I would get a balance of 945, which was the balance just after the 12th payment, minus 50, I'd get 895 would be that balance at time 13. So let me kind of clean it up. I get a balance at time 13 of 895. And then the question, if the question is what is the amount of principal that's repaid from time 10 to time 13, well, there's a couple of ways that we can do it. We have a lot of information on the screen here. We won't normally have all this information, but with all the information on the screen, I think the easiest thing to do, well, both of what I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you two different things. Both of them are kind of easy, I think. The amount of principal repaid from time 10 to time 13 would be, well, you could just look at what I have highlighted in blue. You're repaying 20 at time 11, 35 at time 12, and 50 at time 13. So add it up and you got 105. But another way that you could do that is just by looking at the balance at time 10 being 1,000 and the balance at time 13 being 895, and saying, well, that's what my balance is. So if I take the difference between those balances, that's how much I've repaid then. So 1,000 minus the 895 or 105 is the amount that's been repaid. Now I'm about to show you some mathematical expressions and stuff, and we'll get to a formula. I kind of hesitate to show that to you though, because I'd rather you just think through this sort of stuff and say, okay, if I want the balance from time, if I want the amount of principal that I've repaid from time 10 to time 13, then I just look at the balance at time 10 and the balance at time 13, and I take the difference. Okay, but symbolically what I'm doing then is I would represent the amount of principal repaid from time 10 to time 13 as I wrote this with sigma notation. That's shorthand notation. It's a sum. It's cap P11 plus cap P12 plus cap P13, which you can write abbreviated using that sigma notation. And then that's just the balance at time 10 minus the balance at time 13. And then this is kind of the part that I hesitate on. We could do this more generally. Instead of using 10 and 13, I could use a time K value and a time M value. And then my answer would look like this, that the amount of principal repaid from that time period would be a summation of the cap piece of J values as J ranges over the values K plus 1 to M. And then what I would do to calculate that difference in or that amount of principal repaid is I would just look at the difference in the balances there. So you can see why it's very important to know how to calculate the balances now. I just take the difference between the balance at time K and the balance at time M, and that tells me how much I've repaid in principal over that time period. So then the next type question was, well, what about if instead of looking at the amount of principal that you're repaying, what about the amount of interest that you're paying over a time period? So let's go back and use the same numbers that I had before, and let's say I'm looking from time 10 to time 13. Well, I have all this extra information in this particular problem. I got a lot of information in this problem. In particular, I have those interest payments at times 11, 12, and 13. They're 195 and 90, so I just add those up, and that's how much interest I paid. I paid 100 in interest at time 11, 95 in interest at time 12, and 90 in interest at time 13. So the sum of that would be the 285. A lot of times you won't have that information. All that you'll have to work with are, all you'll have to work with there are, the balances. You can calculate the balances, and maybe you know what the payments are, and so forth. And so another way to calculate, though, then the interest that's being repaid is I could I could think of this as the total amount of the payments that I made over those time periods. So the 120 plus 130 plus 140 is the amount of the payments that I paid. So I paid that much off total. I'm sorry, I made that much total in payments. The 120 plus 130 plus 140 is how much I've made total in payments. Subtract from that the amount that you've repaid in principal, which is the 20, the 35, and the 50, and then that result would give you the same value. Notice that the 100 in the line after it says answer, the 100 there would be the where the 100 came from. I could think of that as being 120 minus a 20. And so if you distribute the after in the equation it comes after the or statement there, if you would get rid of the parentheses, you see there's a 120 minus a 20. That's where the 100 came from. There's a 130 minus a 35. That's where the 95 came from, and so forth. And so that would be a second way for you to actually calculate if you don't actually have the amounts of interest at the particular time periods, which generally you won't. The information you normally have will be the payment amounts. You'll normally have the payment amounts. So I have the 120, the 130, and the 140. So I have that. And then what I'll do is I'll recognize that the 20 plus the 35 plus the 50 in that second set of parentheses that I just highlighted in blue, that's the sum of the, or that's the total amount of principal that was repaid during that time period, which I found before would just be the difference between the balances at time 10 and time 13. And so let me try to kind of capture everything. And what I'm saying here is that if I'm looking for the amount of interest paid over the time period from 10 to 13, symbolically that would be using shorthand notation, that sigma cap I sub j from 11 to 13, then it's the sum of the payments minus the sum of the principal amounts repaid. But then the second the last summation there is just the amount of principal that's being repaid from time 10 to time 13, and I know that that's just the difference in the book values. And so this will typically be the easier way to calculate the amount of principal that's repaid in a time period. Take the total amount of payments that are paid in the time period and then subtract off the amount of principal that's repaid, which I can do by a difference in balances there. And then we can generalize it. This is, again, I kind of hesitate to show you this general statement because you might be tempted to memorize this formula, and I don't want you to memorize the formula. Just want you to think about it and just do it. Think about it enough for it to make sense to you, and then it's much easier than trying to memorize and apply a formula. But this is what it would be. The amount of interest is the sum of the payments minus the amount of principal that's repaid. All right, so just summarizing here, the amount of principal repaid between two time periods, K and time M, would just be the difference in the balances at time K and M. So that's easy enough. And then if I want to calculate the amount of interest paid over a time period, then I would add up all of the payment amounts. That's how much I paid, and then subtract from that what I just did, the amount of principal that's repaid over that time period. So I think it would be better for you to remember this verbally than to try to remember it as a formula. I think you're setting yourself up to fail this exam if you try to memorize a bunch of formulas. It's easier just to learn the bigger picture on things. Okay, well, that does it for this video, and I'll see you in the next video.